All right. Well, welcome to the Q1 Graph 2023 participant update. We're super excited to share everything that has happened over the last quarter with you all, and also chat a little bit about our goals for Q2 this quarter. So just a quick reminder, we are recording today's call. If you don't want to be recorded, make sure to turn off your video, change your name, and there is a question link. So feel free to drop any questions throughout this presentation, and we will get to it at the end. So what a journey it's been. I was preparing for today's presentation, I was looking at the data, and we are at over 550 billion queries across the hosted service and the decentralized network. We don't really talk about the hosted service anymore just because all eyes are on the decentralized network. And a really big goal is to get a lot of those queries that are on the hosted service over to the network. But it's just exciting to kind of take a moment and look at how far we've come. If you look across the crypto ecosystem, there's not a lot of projects that have been used 550 billion times, maybe Ethereum, maybe Bitcoin. So it is really an exciting accomplishment, and it's one that all of you have supported and enabled. So really grateful to be on this journey with all of you. And day by day, the graph is becoming this data marketplace for all of the data in the decentralized web, with new launches like file data sources, substreams, Firehose. We'll get into more of that soon, but it is really exciting just to see the evolution of the graph, and there's just still so much more to go. So quick disclaimer, as always, there are no forward-looking statements in this document or presentation. For those of you who don't know, I'm Taken Klein. I'm the co-founder of Edge and Node. I lead business, and we have closed out a very strong quarter. This quarter, we're seeing query fees at the highest point we've ever seen in the USD equivalent. And what's really exciting is just the opportunity that there still is to come. There's almost 1,000 subgraphs on the decentralized network. Some of those are not yet fully in production. And there's over 39,000 lifetime queries on the hosted, or lifetime subgraphs on the hosted service. So we're excited to continue helping applications get over to the decentralized network. And we'll talk a little bit about the evolution of that in this presentation. So there have been some major milestones this quarter. One, more of a vanity metric, but still exciting, is the graph made Fortune's crypto top 40 list. There are 8 different categories in the crypto space, and the graph came in 3rd in the data category. And Fortune is just a tier 1 media publication. So it's exciting to see this kind of recognition, and also number 1, we're coming for you. And with that, we saw 2.5 million GRT query fees. This was actually a goal on the business side for the end of Q1, and actually right at the end of Q1, we hit this metric. So it was pretty exciting and a celebratory moment. So what does that look like? This is the growth that you can see. And this is just in terms of the GRT evolution across Polygon, and now Arbitrum is in the mix. And with this, what's exciting is that the billing balance is almost double what the GRT query fees are. So this is showing that more developers and applications are filling up their balances, their GRT balances, to make sure that they have enough spend when their applications are used. So it just shows kind of the trust in the billing process that we've been working hard on. And also with this, it's important to point out that there's 41% quarter-over-quarter growth in USD terms at the end of Q1. So this is just showing more and more dApp usage on the decentralized network, helping developers and applications kind of decentralize their API layer. So with that, there's some exciting stats. So participants are up and to the right across subgraphs, query fees, indexers, delegators. We're seeing a lot of growth across all of these metrics. So on the subgraph side, 26% quarter-over-quarter growth, and this actually beat last quarter's growth of 24% quarter-over-quarter growth. So it's exciting to see that increase at a more progressive rate. When it comes to the query fees, 480K at 41% quarter-over-quarter. So this is across all active network subgraphs. And then on the indexer side, the indexer community has really grown with 58% quarter-over-quarter increase. a lot of credit to the MIPS program here. Just as we go multi-chain, more and more indexers are joining the ecosystem to help serve queries. And so, Web 2 today has very few indexers, right? You have a few large players. They kind of get to decide what data is indexed. And within the graph ecosystem, there's over 460 indexers that are serving queries and indexing data. So, if one indexer doesn't want to index the data, that's okay, because there'll be others to index the data. And then on the delegation side, delegators only slightly increased, but we're grateful to welcome new delegators to the ecosystem. And we've actually closed out at the largest delegations flowing in with 2 billion DRT in active delegation. So really exciting. And our move to Arbitrum will make the barrier to entry on delegating, indexing, and curation lower. So we expect to see more delegation then. And with that, I just want to double click into Mazari's Q1 State of the Graph report. A lot of up into the right metrics, but what's really exciting here is that the network distributed the highest number of indexer rewards to delegators ever on record. So it's exciting to see that more rewards are going to indexers and also to delegators, and they're stewarding that delegation to the delegators. On this slide, the hosted service versus the network, it's super exciting to see kind of things happening on par or better with the hosted service. So on the uptime, it really is unbeatable with 460 indexers serving queries at any time. Also, I want to point out the median latency here, which is really impressive, as well as the query success rate. And one piece on this is just the quality of service. I was chatting to Brandon the other day, and we're seeing quality of service in 3 nines. And people told us that 3 nines of quality of service on a decentralized network would be impossible to achieve. And here we are, beating that. And I think that that's something that everyone here should really be proud of. And when I was chatting with Brandon, he was sharing that it's not uncommon for centralized providers to see 4 nines or 5 nines in the traditional world. And I was like, well, I want to beat those. And Brandon's like, well, we don't really have to beat those. It's okay to kind of be on par, because when you don't need to be 10x better than centralized providers when we're 1,000x better in other areas like openness, composability, network effects, public goods, unstoppable applications. So all of these things really shine through when the product or the core offering is on par with centralized providers. And Brandon has a really great analogy around electric cars. And so Brandon, I want to pass the torch to you to kind of double click into that analogy.
Yeah, thanks, Tegan. So one of the analogies I've given the core developer ecosystem is to kind of think of the choice of building on decentralized infrastructure like that of purchasing an electric vehicle. And in both those instances, there's all these other societal benefits and sort of secondary benefits that Tegan was alluding to. But if the total cost of ownership of a car, an EV, is not competitive with the gas car, or if the convenience of charging networks isn't as convenient as the gas stations, then people aren't going to make that choice to switch to EV. But those aren't basis of competition where EVs need to be 10x better, right? It's not that charging stations need to be 10x more convenient than gas stations. It's not that the total cost of ownership needs to be 10x better than that of gas vehicles. It's that they need to be table stakes competitive so that all these other benefits of, in this case, EVs, but in our case, building on decentralized infrastructure can shine. One of the predictions that we made at Graph Day a year ago is that, the decentralized network would actually be better than any centralized alternative. And I'll point out that even though, many traditional SaaS products do get 4 and 5 nines, which we're really close to on the decentralized network, the best comparison that we have for this particular type of service today is the hosted service. And this problem area is unique because there's so many upstream dependencies on the blockchains themselves and on RPC providers and so on and so forth that can lead to those, that can impact those quality of service numbers. So already today, the best centralized service that we know of for solving this use case, which is the Graphs hosted service, is now being outdone by the decentralized network across all the main quality of service metrics that we're tracking. So it's a really exciting milestone, and super proud of all the core devs that have put in the work to make that happen.
Amazing. Thank you, Brandon. And with that, I want to look at some of the network statistics here. So this is super exciting to see just the rate at which the speed is increasing. So it took 60 days to go from 400 subgraphs to 500 subgraphs on the decentralized network. It took 77 days to go from 500 to 600, and 61 days to go from 600 to 700. And a spoiler alert, this is kind of a spoiler for next quarter, but we've actually gone to 13 days to go from 800 subgraphs to 900 subgraphs. And obviously the tech and the improvements are a massive component to this, but also strategy and the time that's gone into the white gloving process. The team is coordinating with DAOs across the graph ecosystem to really speed up migrations, and it's starting to show with this rate at which it's increasing. And we're sitting here at almost 1,000 subgraphs on the decentralized network. Not all of them are there. Some of them are still testing and they're not fully using their front end in production. So there's still opportunity there, but this really is the tip of the iceberg, and we're excited to see this flywheel effect continue. Now, double clicking into some of the subgraphs on the network, this really is who the spotlight should be on. We provide this infrastructure so that these applications can flourish and shine. And there are over 150 subgraphs that are used in production for on-chain data on the decentralized network today. And one thing that's really exciting here that is an opportunity for us is that third-party data consumers, so that's not the applications themselves, that's other companies or other projects querying the open subgraphs, that is a big percentage of the traffic on the hosted service. And as we get closer to Fusion and to phase 2, we can really start to push those third-party queryers to the decentralized network, which is exciting. And a lot of them are actually hungry to start paying for queries on the network, as some of them maybe don't trust some things that are quote unquote free. So that's a really exciting opportunity for us, and more to share on that soon. And then we've heard from you that demystifying the token economics is something that many of you have asked for. And so we spent some time working on this image and clarifying some of the token economics in the documentation. So thank you for that feedback. And so here, I just want to point out that, how the GRT work utility token works. And it's important to state that it is a utility work token. So only purchase what you intend to use on the network. But this is really what the incentive structure looks like. And there's incentives for good behavior and then disincentives for bad behavior across the indexer, curator, and delegator ecosystem. And I'm always happy to kind of dive into any of this with you. If you want to do a deep dive session, just let me know. With that, the progress on multi-chain on the network. So this really has been a big initiative. There are now 5 chains on the decentralized network. We've been helping applications on these chains migrate. We've also been working with a lot of these teams to make a lot of noise, both at the chain level and also at the application level. And there's progress to unblock Phantom, Optimism, and Polygon on the network this quarter, fingers crossed. And we are there to kind of help white glove these applications over to the network. But there's still a long ways to go. This is only 8 out of 40 chains. So we're continuing to try and unblock some of the chains on the network. And if you have opinions on which chains you would like to see next in Wave 2, please let us know. And with that, I want to pass it over to Brandon Ramirez, our interim CEO at Edge and Node, and the original founder of The Graph. He'll chat a little bit about some of the improvements, launches, integrations, and tech in production.
Thanks, Tegan. Can we go to the next slide, please? Yeah, so I want to kick off by talking about a bunch of UI and developer experience improvements that we've been making in the Graph network. So we talked about quality of service and the huge milestones we've made, earlier in the call. But, within the Graph core dev ecosystem, we've typically talked about, quality of service, cost of service, and developer experience as being the 3 pillars. So we need to be table stakes all of those, not just quality service. And so you're seeing a lot of effort being put into the developer experience now that we've hit a lot of these key quality of service milestones. So Tegan, if you can go to the next slide. So a big one here is Arbitrum migration. And there's kind of a few layers to this, but I just want to emphasize how ambitious it is to upgrade a protocol like the graph while it's live and running. It may not be quite at the level of complexity of Ethereum's merge, but it really is like upgrading an airplane while you're flying it. And I'm super proud of the core developer teams, the smart contract engineers working on this that have sort of flawlessly been handling the migration from layer 1 to layer 2 for the graph. Right now, we have a full running version of the protocol on Arbitrum, and we have turned on 5% of the network's indexing rewards are now being directed towards Arbitrum. There's a GIP 52 in the forums, if you're interested, that actually outlines the schedule to gradually shift all the indexing rewards that are going to the L1 protocol to eventually be 100% directed towards the L2 protocol running on Arbitrum. This is super exciting already. After this very first phase of 5% indexing rewards, we've seen quality of service parity on Arbitrum for subgraphs between subgraphs that are on L2 and subgraphs that are on L1. And we've seen massive cost improvements. So anecdotally, some of the key transactions that indexers have to do, like opening and closing allocations, we've seen be 130 times cheaper on Arbitrum than they were on Ethereum L1. And these are not only savings that goes into the indexer's bottom line, but they can invest that in infrastructure and more meaningful capital expenditures that drive quality of service in the network. They can pass on savings to consumers and subgraph developers. But importantly, it also makes the network far more dynamic, because now when an indexer is thinking about, hey, supporting the latest subgraph that just got deployed, or switching stake from one subgraph to another, they don't have to think every time I take one of those actions, I'm taking this huge hit in terms of gas costs. Finally, I will say that for many of the future developer experience improvements that you're going to that you've heard us talk about and you're going to continue hearing us talk about, having cheaper gas costs is a huge enabler. So things like doing on-chain subscriptions and recurring payments that make the developer experience for billing feel much more like a SaaS experience wouldn't be possible today on Ethereum L1 in that gas cost environment. But Arbitrum has made those things possible. Next slide. So the first step of many, actually this isn't even the first, because earlier this year we streamlined the movement of tokens from L1 onto the L2 billing contract in Arbitrum. But kind of the next step in this process of making the billing experience really table stakes competitive with any SaaS product is making sure that we're really addressing the needs of the projects that are still sort of stuck in the legacy world of using banks and credit cards as their primary form of managing expenses. So Banxa is a partnership that was announced earlier this year. They have a fiat on-ramp that's integrated directly into the Subgraph Studio, and that lets people quickly use a credit card to basically get GRT directly on Arbitrum that can be then immediately be used for billing and for paying for queries. Next. Let's go one more. So another big announcement we had earlier this year was file data sources. These are now live on the network in experimental mode. This has been a long requested feature for supporting a lot of use cases, in particular NFTs. It required a pretty deep re-architecture of the way that we even do indexing in subgraphs, because previously you sort of anytime a file became available or unavailable, you would have to roll back the entire chain history to the point where that file was first indexed. Now we sort of have concurrent indexing jobs for the on-chain data and the off-chain data. So we can kind of continue syncing the on-chain data, and as files become available or unavailable, such as the ones that are used for NFT metadata, the subgraph can kind of just grab that metadata, add it to the state of the subgraph, and kind of continue business as usual. For now, this feature is labeled experimental because the graph doesn't yet have a oracle for data availability that we really rely on. The ecosystems looked at projects like Celestia and Eigenlayer as potentially being part of the solution space there. But in the meantime, we expect subgraph developers to sort of use indexers that have high reputation and have a good track record of responding to queries across other subgraphs. Next, please. Another big developer quality of life improvement we've made recently is the activity feed. So this is, I would say not part of like one of our big strategic, initiatives, but it's been something that's been super highly requested. It's something that really takes developers out of the flow of using the graph, right? If like you're coming up on a subgraph and like to understand what's happening to that subgraph, then you need to go out to, ether scan or, some other source of data to really understand the activity on that subgraph. That's going to kind of take you out of the flow of like doing the things that you're trying to do day to day as a subgraph developer. And so the activity feed kind of gives you a native way integrated into the subgraph studio where developers are already spending their time to see exactly what's happening on the subgraphs they care about, whether it's indexers, staking on those subgraphs, whether it's upgrades to those subgraphs, curation activity, et cetera. Next. So we have some exciting new subgraph studio integrations to announce. If we can go to the next slide. One of the things that we wanted to make sure was that we weren't, even as we do this giant push to the decentralized network, we recognize that, the blockchain ecosystem isn't standing still. And we didn't want to leave new chains that need, data indexing and querying kind of in the lurch. And so we made the decision to integrate Polygon Hermes, now ZK EVM, ZK Sync, and Coinbase's newly announced Base Layer 2 directly into the subgraph studio. And currently it's using the studio, a non-rate limited version of the studio's sandbox infrastructure. So it's still hosted subgraphs. But now that they've been integrated directly into the studio, when these chains eventually migrate to the decentralized network, it'll basically be a one-click type thing to get those subgraphs into the decentralized network. So it's a much lower bar to cross than, for example, the chains we're currently migrating from the hosted service. And we have some new tech in production to talk about. This is a really exciting one that's I think people have been following closely, ever since we talked about this at Graph Day last year. So, I think last Graph Day we announced a developer preview for substreams. This was a new project that stemmed from, I believe it was the Cancun core developer retreat earlier last year in like January. And it's made an incredible amount of progress very, very quickly. The latest updates are that the Substreams team released hosted endpoints for basically production ready usage of Substreams. Now, these are still hosted, but what we're going to learn from projects using these endpoints in production is going to be super, super important for us to figure out the best way to integrate and design the economics for supporting Substreams natively in the decentralized network. Some of you may have seen the GIP, the number escapes me, but it's a World of Data Services, which is a proposal in the core dev ecosystem that's hinted at making the graph multi-service. So instead of just having subgraphs as a single service, think about supporting Firehose, Substreams, subgraphs, key value stores, maybe SQL. So there's really a lot of possibilities here. And this is an exciting first step. I'll say the first place where you're going to see this adding a lot of value to the network near term is in what we're calling Substreams enabled subgraphs. So this is using the existing subgraph framework with Substreams as a data source into those subgraphs. And already there we're seeing, so in that pattern, you end up with some, because of the database, you end up with some load tends to be the bottleneck, loading entities into the database. So you don't see the full 100x right away necessarily, but that gets you like 10 to 30x because, the database takes time to build the indices, manage, entity version snapshots for time travel queries and stuff like that. But this is already super exciting. We're seeing really notable subgraphs that used to take weeks to index now sync in a matter of hours. And to one of the questions that I already saw come in the chat, this has been one of the biggest requested features, indexing time to get, certain, especially the high data projects from the hosted service into the decentralized network. So even before we see the full-fledged, world of data services in the decentralized network, I think substreams enabled subgraphs is going to be a big, piece of the narrative that you'll be hearing a lot more about. And with that, I'll hand it back to Tegan.
Thank you. Appreciate it. And with that, a lot is planned for Q2, and we want to share a little bit about the priorities and goals. A lot happened in Q1, but we're pushing to ship even more this quarter. So with that, some of the biggest priorities, as mentioned, getting Polygon, Phantom, and Optimism on the decentralized network, as well as a plan for the next wave of chains to go live on the network. Also, reoccurring payments and subscriptions. This will be a really big one. Right now, a lot of developers and individuals across the ecosystem are manually adding GRT to their balances for their DApp usage. And this will allow them to take that away so it can just flow seamlessly, similar to an experience you have with a credit card today. The Arbitrum Layer 2 integration, which we touched upon, this will really lower the barrier to entry for delegators, indexers, curators, and it'll also allow us to start doing some advanced tasks around delegation with some of like Coinbase Earn and CoinMarketCap Earn as an example. And then, as Brandon mentioned, substreams enabled subgraphs. This is a big one, as a lot of the high production subgraphs are waiting on this because of those syncing speeds, because it takes sometimes weeks, sometimes over a month to sync. And with this, it'll enable these applications to sync quickly and migrate to the decentralized network. And then with that, of course, migrations is a huge priority that rolls over from the last quarter. And I'll also add, we're working on Fusion, which is just work with inside the subgraph studio, and then unblocking phase 2 or phase 1. And phase 1 of the sunrise of decentralized data is when we will no longer allow applications or subgraphs to spin up on the hosted service across different chains that are ready for that. And with that, I want to pass it over to Sam Green, the co-founder and head of research at Semiotic, one of the core devs within the graph ecosystem, to talk about some of the work they're doing on the AI and machine learning side.
Thanks, Tegan. Hi, everyone. So we've been working on AI-related projects for the past few years. We have 2 tools that are currently deployed today in the protocol, and we have a lot of our top indexers are using these tools. The first one that we are building and that is released and we continue to improve is called AutoAgora. So AutoAgora is a reinforcement learning based tool, and RL, by the way, is it's from the family of AI that makes ChatGPT work. So we're actually using the same algorithm under the hood for AutoAgora that ChatGPT uses to fine-tune its responses to make them better. AutoAgora is used for indexers to automatically set query prices. So basically what it does is it models the computational costs that queries take on the indexer's infrastructure, and then automatically sets prices based on those resource costs. And it adjusts. The reinforcement learning aspect is that on the fly, it adjusts prices according to market demand. And so it can increase or decrease prices to maximize the indexer's revenue and be more competitive. The allocation optimizer is another automated decision-making tool, but it is more from the field of what's called non-convex optimization. It's more of a mathematical based tool than an AI-based tool, still for automated decision-making. In the protocol, indexers have to choose which subgraphs to index. And this tool, choosing which subgraph to index, it's a complex decision-making process where you actually have to do a lot of math, and DevOps have a bunch of DevOps knowledge to know which subgraphs to index. It's a hard problem. And this tool automates all of the, takes all of the different factors in it, automates the process for indexers. And what this does for the protocol, or what it does for the indexers first, is it maximizes their revenue, because indexers are rewarded based on following, indexing the subgraphs that have the indexing subgraphs proportional to the amount of curation signal on subgraphs. So this helps them do that. And similarly, it helps the network because it makes sure that all of the subgraphs that have signal have the appropriate amount of indexing on them. And finally, the network testing that we've done. So, or we have AI tools that are used for testing the protocol. And so when we build these tools, these AI tools, we have to simulate certain aspects of the protocol to make sure that our tools are working. And in the process, we have in the past discovered, we basically stress test the network as our agents are learning. And we've discovered weaknesses that we've then been able to fix. And we will continue to do that as we continue with our tool development. So finally, maybe what is exciting to a lot of people these days are large language models like ChatGPT. And the graph is basically everybody in the graph ecosystem is excited about the prospect that LLMs bring. So specifically, some low-hanging fruit that we see are basically providing a natural language way to query the graph's data. So imagine a future where in any language that you speak, whether that's English, Spanish, Mandarin, you name it, you'll be able to ask a question about Web3 data. And then under the hood, we will convert that question in natural language to all of the technical queries, specifically GraphQL today. And then we will return the results in a understandable form to the person who's looking for the data. And these sorts of approaches are going to really expand the number of people that we can serve our data to. So we're at Semiotic. We are working on R&D to support this. We are also collaborating with other members of the graph ecosystem to support their tool development. So you're going to see a lot of similar LLM-based tooling in the ecosystem in the short term and in the years to come. So finally, if you'd like to learn more about what we're doing today and what we're planning to do, there is a link at the bottom of this page to a blog post that we recently wrote. So I'm now passing it over to Eva, Director of the Graph Foundation, to talk about the roadmap, a multi-chain on the network, and GIPs, before Tegan shares some thank yous and asks, and then we'll jump into Q&A. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Sam. And sorry, I'll keep my video off just because I'm in a low Wi-Fi zone. Next slide, please. Awesome. So looking back and forward on our roadmap, a bit of this has been covered already by Brandon, Tegan, and Sam, but just wanted to make a few more highlights. So, we've got these 5 working groups that we work across. So, for example, Substream's work comes out of the Data and APIs working group. Every working group's kind of working on their own things. One thing I want to highlight just off the top is GraphCast and POI Radio. So this is basically like a gossip network for the graph, making it much easier for indexers to communicate with each other. And in the most basic sense, this might just be messaging, but long term, we view this actually as a piece of the data integrity story, in making sure that indexers are sharing the accurate data with their users. Brandon mentioned some of the billing improvements, but I don't know if he quite highlighted as significantly that now all developers can pay with credit card and fiat with the graph. So this has been one of the biggest pieces of feedback we've received is developers wanting to access the graph without having to have GRT directly, and now they can do that. And we'll have a lot more features that come through. Another that I wanted to highlight here was off-chain data sources. So long time coming has been full support for NFTs, meaning actually being able to index the NFT data itself, not just the transaction data. And we can do that now as well with support for IPFS, and we'll be adding other data sources over time as well to make sure we cover the entire use case. One last one I'll cover here is standardized subgraphs. So Messari has been working over the past year on how do we make it easier for the entire world of dApps to access data. The graph is obviously the infrastructure, but even the human elements. And so, with the standardized subgraphs that Messari has built, there's now a standard across different categories and verticals that makes it very easy for different applications and protocols to coordinate around. So what do I mean by that? An example would be a standard definition for TDL and other metrics that otherwise are very different across the board. If you look at DeFi Llama and a few others, they all kind of have a different answer for what TDL is. So, we start here with standardized subgraphs, and where it ends up for the users is highly accurate data. And we're making sure that the graph has all of the most accurate data at all times. Next slide. So Tegan touched on the chains that we've already supported. I just want to go over what's next. So, we've got 8 chains throughout the MIPS program. Those 3 other chains, Optimism, Polygon, and Phantom, are coming very shortly. And we want to create a much more public process for new chain integration. So, we've got over 40 chains that the hosted service supports. A bunch of those still need to migrate over themselves. And then we still continuously get requests from the community to support new chains. So our goal is to create a very public GIP process such that any indexer can then, run the chain after it's been accepted and approved by the council. And then having, much more service on the network than even the hosted service today, because we are limited, in sort of the resources that we have to grow the hosted service. And our focus really is growing the network. The last point on here is collaborating with client teams. So maybe a call to action is here is, anyone here who has relationships with client teams across chains to please let us know, because we've gotten a lot more involved basically with the client and chain teams to make sure that clients are meeting the needs that indexers have and users have. So for example, the Polygon Aragon client wasn't quite there yet. And we started collaborating with both teams to make sure they can serve Polygon Aragon users well. And our goal basically is, as more of our infrastructure like Firehose comes out, that we can actually push that upstream to the client teams instead of having the chain teams get involved here. So an example of this has been Aptos, and we've also spoken with other teams like Starkware about getting Firehose directly embedded into the code. I won't go over this too much in detail because some of this was mentioned, but as you can see, we've been quite busy with GIPs. I would say this has probably been our busiest quarter in the last 2 years with the number of technical GIPs, so really exciting. Bear markets are definitely build markets. And a few I'll highlight here is, GIP 52 that Brandon mentioned, that's the the final indexing rewards moving over. And we've got a staggered plan to make sure that there's safety on the network, that users are continuing to be served on mainnet as the transition to L2 occurs. And then we've also got L2 migration helpers. So really making sure that the entire indexing ecosystem is robust during this migration. One thing we like to think a lot about is making sure that and any transition that dApps have to go through isn't disruptive. And so these GIPs really make that possible. I'll also highlight just the first one, GIP 42. So this is, world of data services. This is sort of a new direction that the graph is taking, where substreams and subgraphs become 2 data services. But really, there's so many more opportunities we have going forward. So I think this is a really interesting GIP where it was, specifically scoping 2 substreams, but it's actually also the start of sort of a new generation within the graph of figuring out how do we embed new data services into the network.
Thank you, Eva. Okay, amazing. With that, my favorite part of the presentation is just the thank yous. So a lot of you have been super supportive. And so thank you to Kyle from Multicoin, Reciprocal Ventures, Framework, DCG, and FinTech Collective for all of the help over that one very long weekend we all had together around and connecting us to Tier 1 banking connections, as well as Future Perfect Ventures. Thank you for your guidance during Operation Choke Point 2.0. Thank you to John Choi for all the suggestions around the narrative and strategy. Thank you to Michael, Craig, and Ali from Reciprocal Ventures for all the strategy and growth guidance. And a special shout out to Ali for the BD introduction shared. Thank you, Lubin, for the time during ETH Denver. And a shout out to all the graph, the graph advocates DAO, as well as the graph builder DAO, who are working hard on migrations. Now, how you can help. So you can sign up for the developer newsletter that's recently launched. You can also delegate on the graph to help secure the network. Let us know if you need help. We're here to support any of you through that journey. I know some of you are even running indexers, so if you have interest in doing that, feel free to reach out to us. Also, as Eva mentioned, the Firehose integration mass adoption. We really want to help chains start running Firehose. So if there are any chains that you are connected to, please let us know. And then we're hiring across the graph ecosystem. On the Edge and Node side, we're hiring for a VP of engineering. We're hiring for 2 business development roles, a Rust engineer, a product engineering manager, a senior product manager, a UI and UX designer. There's actually a few roles on the designer side. And then the Graph Foundation is hiring a subgraph dev. The Guild is hiring an open source dev, and Semiotic is hiring a DevOps engineer. So if you know anyone that could fill these roles, please connect us. And of course, any opportunities, speaking, podcasts, press opportunities, we're here for it. If you want to host an event at the House of Web3 in San Francisco, just let us know. And then we're always here to take any advice and feedback that you have. And we've been super receptive to the feedback we've received so far. So we're really always open to any suggestions you all have. And then, of course, inviting your community to be a graph advocate. And with that, we can dive into the Q&A segment. Kyle, Caroline, do you want to share some of the questions asked?
Yeah, I could take those. Let's see. First one is, are all the subgraphs on the decentralized network being used for data? And if not, why not? Take it if it's okay, I can take that. I'd say that, yeah. So I'd say definitely not. As Tegan alluded to a bit near the beginning of the call, many teams actually need to test very heavily before using the network in production. And that can take weeks to months to, most importantly, find the capacity, but also get comfortable before switching over and using something in production. So what's important is that a large portion of the subgraphs on the decentralized network are curated. They are synced by multiple indexers and are actively being tested by DApp teams around the world. So this means that it's hopefully only a matter of time before they migrate over to the network in the near to midterm future. So the more that publish, the more they get curated on the network, the more exciting things become, even if it takes time to fully migrate over for any given reason. So I'd say no, but it's a great leading indicator on what's to come with the network in general. Second one would be, what are the biggest blockers for people that can and will move to the decentralized network? Tegan, maybe you want to take that first, and then I can fill in some of the blanks.
Perfect. Yeah. So a big one is just the different chains across the network. I think a lot of people are really excited about Polygon as an example going live on the network, as well as other chains, many applications across many different chains. So that is a big one, but also substreams powered subgraphs for a lot of the large high traffic applications. They're really waiting for that to light up so that they can migrate over. And on the Fusion side, that will allow us to start migrating over the third-party queriers. So not necessarily the applications themselves, but third parties that are querying those subgraphs. I would say that we're also working on our data collection on the Net Promoter Score as an example. So different pieces there. But yeah, Brian and Kyle, feel free to jump in with anything I missed.
Yeah, I think those two hit like probably 2 of the top 3. But I'd say the biggest blocker by far is simply teams finding capacity to migrate the subgraph and get the testing done. And most of the time it's them just thinking that it takes more time. And the process is getting much simpler, much faster, not only to Arbitrum, but everything that the core dev ecosystem is working on. And other than those 3, there are smaller blockers, such as those related to functionality and feature parity with the hosted service, such as the UX, DX improvements that Brandon went over. But those are temporary blockers. They're in our sites, and it's really only a matter of time before all blockers in that realm are taken down and all volume is able to migrate and rely on the network for the really just the best uptime, lowest latency, and most resilient data layer in Web3, which we're consistently seeing is by far the most important factors in using any data technology. So yes, just a matter of time. Let's go to the next one. Brandon, do you have anything else to add that you're seeing on the R&D side and tech side?
No, I think it was super well said. I think to echo, like, one of the big things is like we also offer a free hosted alternative today, right? And like that is going to go away. That's something we've made clear to, the developer community, but we also, to Tegan's point, want to make sure that things like, developer churn, net promoter score on the decentralized network are rock solid. And so we're really letting the data and kind of the first, hand experience and feedback we're getting from developers be the guide on when the right timing is. But that's going to be a huge, obviously the eventual deprecation of the hosted service is going to be a huge catalyst for migration.
Nice. And this next one might be for you, Brandon, to start. Will tokenomics change over time as network adoption grows? For example, indexing rewards, will there always be a 3% inflation rate, or is there something that might change over time?
Yeah, it's a great question. So every time we've gotten this question, we've said not yet, right? Because there's higher priority things we want to improve about the network. And as soon as the Graph Council or the governance starts touching things like the indexing reward rate, like you sort of invite a political process to start playing out. And frankly, like that's not, anyone really wants the core dev ecosystem or researchers to be focusing on. Certainly, if the research, longer term research indicates that that's something that we should do in the future, that's not something that, we're closed off to. One change that's happened recently that was a little bit subtle was actually the way the indexing was computed was modified when we supported Arbitrum because of the challenges in synchronizing indexing rewards across L1 and L2. So it was switched to a much simpler linear rewards calculation that actually has a slight decay built into it. It's like very, very slow decay, very slow drift that the council can, modify the parameters to keep it at the 3% target. But that already sort of lays the groundwork. And some core developers have asked that, hey, maybe we just allow that decay to play out. So that's a conversation that's happening. That's not something that's by any means, final or, decided upon, but definitely if you have feedback, I encourage you to hop into the forums and, voice your opinion on, how you would like to see, the network evolve.
Yeah, and I'll also just add that the token economics will likely evolve. I think there's a lot that the community and we've learned since launching the initial phase of the token economics. And so, as Brandon mentioned, feel free to voice your opinions. You can always propose GIPs, and yeah, the community welcomes your feedback.
Yeah, that's what's exciting about this. Everyone can participate. Everyone should participate. So it's not just the core dev teams or the Graph Foundation. It's pretty much the world building this out, which is exciting. Brandon, this next one's probably for you as well. Are substreams something everyone will use, and therefore will subgraphs no longer be a standard going forward in the future?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And I alluded to this a little bit earlier in the talk when I talked about substreams enabled subgraphs, but a huge part of the multi-data services story in the graph is all about composition. And composition allows you to use the right tool for the right job and form more complex and sort of heterogeneous like data pipelines. So, as we've already talked about, I think a really big example of that is going to be substreams data being consumed directly into subgraphs to be queried via GraphQL, the way that application developers like to do that today. There's a lot of benefits to that pattern. For one, subgraphs are a lot easier to reason about, just their execution model, their query model, than substreams. Even if you take Rust out of the equation, which today you have to write substreams in Rust, and you can write subgraphs in assembly script, the framework, the execution model of substreams is just inherently more complex. And so it may not be the case that every developer wants to write substreams to take advantage of the performance benefits of substreams. But the beauty is that they don't need to, because there's great developers already. Masari, a graph core developer being one of them, that's building these catalogs of high quality substreams, and then downstream application developers will be able to pull those substream data sources into their subgraphs use a more familiar, more simple development experience to shape the data into whatever read schema they need to support their UIs, without having to do all the heavy sort of like back-end data engineering, that substream sort of entails. So it's kind of the best of both worlds. I do think that over time, subgraphs will start to be a little bit thinner, and they'll be a little bit more optimized for just shaping data for read schemas and like data access query patterns, as opposed to doing the entire ETL process inside of a subgraph. I think it's more likely going to be, you're going to see more compositional patterns.
Yeah, and so they'll both be a standard, both subgraphs and substreams, maybe some subgraphs for some of the lighter use cases and substreams for some of the larger use cases. And this is unblocking, some of the gaming applications that want to leverage substreams or smart contract wallets. So a lot of new use cases will be enabled with substreams, but it's not one or the other, it's both. And you can kind of think like Arbitrum Nova launched, right, their gaming chain compared to Arbitrum One. And so you can kind of think of it as similar, as like substreams will just be used for kind of higher throughput and maybe, more data ingestion.
I'm excited to see substreams built out, and I'm sure we'll have more use cases in the future on that. The last question I'm seeing, maybe for you, Eva, is there a limit to how many chains we'll be able to integrate with the decentralized network through the GIP integration process you mentioned? Or have you all thought through that? And what does that look like in the near, mid, long term?
Yeah, great question. So there should never be really a limit, especially as the network scales. It's scaling to the size to support that many users. But there is a constraint of indexers running the nodes of those chains. So that is something that we're already starting to think about. How do we best integrate with that ecosystem? So for example, meeting with the Polygon Chain Foundation, the Polygon ecosystem, really sharing and educating the current nodes and validators of those ecosystems about becoming an indexer, because they're essentially already doing half the work by running the node. They would just then have to run graph node. So really that would be the limitation. So for example, as these GIPs roll out, it'll be interesting to see the feedback from the indexer community themselves on sort of their desire to run those chains or support those ecosystems.
And just
one thing I'll add to that, sorry, Teg. One thing I'll add to that real quickly is that if you're a chain ecosystem, a foundation, or a client development team, the best thing you can do today to guarantee that your chain can be added to the graph in a seamless fashion is to integrate Firehose and to natively support that integration. That's something that Tegan alluded to earlier in the talk, but really Firehose we see as kind of the standard for data extraction, and the more chains that natively adopt it, the easier it will be for them to be supported in the graph network. And we've seen some early progress with chains wanting to own their integrations natively.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that the MIPS program is coming to an end, but there's still incentives for indexers to jump on and index the chains going live in the future. And it's really just about activating that node community, that indexer community to rally behind the chain so we can get them supported on the network.
Yeah, and on that, we have one more question, but on that, if you have connections to different chain validator ecosystems, let's work to introduce and cross-pollinate infra providers. So graph indexers can be validators, increase revenue for chains, and validators can help build resilience and increase capacity for chains on the decentralized network. So if you have any introductions there, please loop them into the teams, core devs across the ecosystem, and we could work with them to push that forward. And the last question that just came in, how are our substreams going to be indexed? And is there any idea of how the rewards would work for that? Probably for Brandon and Eva to start.
Yeah, so I can go first. So there was a big meeting of the minds on this in Como, Italy, among the core developers, and thinking through how can not just substreams, but Firehose, key value stores, and the variety of other data sources that you might think of, how could they be integrated simply and effectively into the decentralized network? There's a handful of proposals that are kind of being floated around the core dev ecosystem right now. I'll say the simplest of those actually doesn't require making any changes to the on-chain protocol logic. If you think about how subgraphs work today with the indexing and the query market, the indexing market is already designed for basically paying for a continuous service, right? The process of syncing a subgraph is an ongoing service, similar to the process of processing a substream on an ongoing basis. And the query market that the graph has is already designed for payments for a request response type service, right? So if you send a GraphQL query in the graph, you pay for a single, pay by the query. And the beauty is the on-chain economics and the on-chain smart contract logic is agnostic to the type of service or the type of request response. So today it happens to be the case that these services are, syncing a subgraph and, assembly script mappings and querying via GraphQL. But you could easily swap out that request response for, a SQL query or a key value store query or some other type of streaming job on the, the syncing side. And the protocol economics support that. It's really just sort of off-chain services and handshaking and negotiation between the data consumer and the service provider that need to be specified, but that's really more about specifying interfaces than it is about fundamentally redesigning or rethinking the way the protocol works. So we see a pretty clear path to getting these data services supported in the network.
It looks like we're at time.
Thank you so much for joining and for all the great questions. We really appreciate it. And feel free to send any other questions you have over. Cheers, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.